The wind hit the windshield hard, and the sleet hit the old Land Rover hard as it crawled along the winding lane on the edge of Exmoor. Noah Beckett held onto the wheel tightly, his knuckles hurting, while the wipers tried to keep the world in focus. It was the kind of night that made you remember that nature didn't owe you anything. It was bitter, wild, and merciless. Old dry stone walls lined the road on both sides, and they were bent over from the weight of the snow. The only color in the landscape was the mud, which was being churned up by tire tracks and was quickly fading away as the snow fell. Noah never liked the winter. Not since the debt started to pile up and the cottage his mother left him got colder every year. He had promised Mrs. Bennet that he would check her fences after the last storm, and he wasn't the kind of person who would break a promise. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but there was no signal out here. That's a good thing. No calls, no bills, and no reminders from the bank. There was only the sound of tires hissing and his own thoughts rattling. He slowed down when a thick, sudden bank of fog rolled across the road, blocking the light from his headlights. He let the Land Rover slow down to a crawl. A sound cut through the storm, just barely audible. It was a ragged, panicked breath, something desperate and raw. Noah hit the brakes and rolled down the window. The cold hit his face harder than any threat. He heard it again. Not the wind. There are no foxes or sheep. Something bigger. He took his torch and went into the blizzard. He followed the sound of the ditch next to the wall, where his boots crunched through the crusted snow. There, against the stones, lay a mare. She was as dark as peat, her flanks heaving, and her breath was steaming in the air. It was raining freezing rain, and her coat was slick and matted at the neck. For a second, Noah's heart stopped. He had seen a lot of horses get hurt in this moor, but something about this one, her eyes half open and refusing to close, as if she had some iron will, struck him. He fell to one knee and reached out. The mare was scared but couldn't get up. There was blood on her shoulder, dark against her winter coat. His hand found a bruise on her neck that looked like a rope or wire burn. He swore quietly. Someone had tried to catch her, and they did it quickly and without caring about her pain. He saw a flash of color low on her mane. He pushed aside hair that was in knots. There was a bright blue and white stripe of paint on her skin that crossed in a way that he knew all too well. Mark for auction. Number of the lot. Not a farm nearby, but a planned cull. They were once again rounding up the wild Exmoors, hiding it under the term rewilding, and getting rid of the extras. As the realization hit Noah, the beam of his torch made his breath fog up. He could tell she was pregnant because her belly was round and her sides were shaking as she tried to breathe. She wasn't just lost. They left her to die. Another gust of wind made the snow swirl around them. Noah took off his coat and put it over her. He rubbed her with his hands to keep her awake. "Stay with me, girl," he whispered, partly to her and partly to himself. He took out his phone and waved it over his head, looking for a signal. Nothing. He searched the road. There were no hoofprints, just the deep ruts of a cattle truck that was half full of slush and headed for the Ainsworth land. Lord Sebastian was always talking about sustainability, but no one knew what was going on. The estate had fewer problems with fewer horses, and the wild herds were great for public relations until they became a problem. He made a choice. He didn't have a trailer, but his Land Rover could pull things. He carefully tied a makeshift harness to the trunk with his belt and a length of tow rope, gently pushing the mare along. She stumbled and fell, but then, by some miracle, she got back up. Her legs shook, but the last bits of fire shone in her eyes. Noah took her to the Land Rover, opened the back hatch, and made room for tools and hay. The mare staggered in and fell onto the thick wool blanket he had kept from his mother's days as a shepherd. The drive back was horrible. It was slow and bumpy, and every bump in the road hurt her wounds. He looked in the mirror and saw her ears flick and her nostrils flare with pain, but she was still breathing and fighting. He passed the sign for Foxglove Combe, that old hidden valley that keepers and poachers talked about in hushed tones. The grass always seemed to last a little longer through the freeze there. Noah parked behind Imogen Hale's smithy when he got to the edge of the village. The storm made the forge's windows glow warm, and smoke rose into the black sky. He told himself that Imogen would be the only one who knew what to do. When he stepped outside, snowflakes melted on his neck. He shivered, not just because it was cold, but also because he felt like something had changed that night. He could still feel the ridges of the rope mark on his fingers and see the lot number code in his head, a silent threat that would not go unanswered. Inside the smithy, the light shone on the anvil and the tools that were hanging in neat rows. He hit the door. Imogen answered, her hair a mess, her apron thrown over her shoulders, and her eyes sharp as a hawk's even in the dark. Noah's voice was rough. "Out by the moor, there's a mare. She looks like she's hurt badly and is going to die. Also pregnant." Imogen's face changed. It was hard and sure. "Get her in." Noah knew this was only the beginning when he opened the Land Rover's hatch and the snow got thicker around them. The wind howled across the moor, and somewhere out there, men with trucks and painted hands moved in the dark. Their business was hidden behind the language of nature and progress. Noah gritted his teeth and led the shaking mare inside. He had seen enough of the world to know that some things should not die in the snow. The forge of Imogen Hale roared to life in the dark of winter, sending heat out into the night. The familiar smell of hot iron mixed with the bitter smell of wet horse and blood as Noah helped the hurt mare through the wide side door. Imogen didn't waste any time. She moved her tools off her workbench, pushed a bale of straw out of the way, and told Noah to lead the mare, Bramble, he had started calling her, onto a pile of old feed sacks by the forge. Bramble's sides were steaming. She shuddered, and even though it was cold, her coat was slick with sweat. Imogen crouched next to her, her rough hands soft as she ran her fingers over the mare's bruised neck. Noah's heart raced in his ears. He had seen Imogen fix horses with broken hooves and colts stuck in wire, but nothing like this, nothing so urgent, so raw. Imogen took out a pair of heavy shears and cut off the ends of the rope that were still digging into Bramble's skin. The mare jumped but didn't hit back. Imogen's eyes narrowed as she looked at the paint mark on Bramble's neck. She said under her breath, "That's a transfer code," and wiped the cut with a cloth soaked in antiseptic. "Look at the color. It is the same as Ainsworth's lot from last winter's call." She cut away more of the tangled hair, which showed the bruised skin underneath. She said, "Bastards probably thought no one would notice if a few got left behind." Her voice was flat as iron. Noah knelt next to Bramble and helped keep her head still while Imogen cleaned the wound and put a hot compress on it. He could feel Bramble's breath blowing on his wrists. It was hot and ragged. His own hands shook, not because it was cold but because he felt more and more guilty. He used to work for Ainsworth's men for a season, fixing fences and moving horses. He never asked too many questions about where the extra stock went. He now understood that there was a link between his quiet complicity and the pain he was seeing. Noah quietly said, "She's pregnant," and brushed his hand over Bramble's belly, feeling the tight muscles under her skin. Imogen looked at him, then back at the horse. "She doesn't look like she's due for weeks, but this kind of shock, it could start it early." The smithy's windows shook when it thundered. Imogen moved quickly, grinding herbs, heating water, and making a pace to ease the pain. While she worked, her gray old collie, Moss, walked around nervously before settling down next to Bramble's head and offering silent comfort. Noah found himself mumbling soothing nonsense, as if he could keep the mare from slipping away with his willpower alone. Imogen tied off the compress and then grabbed her phone to take a quick picture of the wound and the paint mark. "I have to show the others. This isn't right." She sent the picture to a group of local horse owners and farmers, which were her people, people who cared about Exmoor's wild herds long before rewilding became a rich man's game. The hours went on and on. Bramble went back and forth between restless sleep and shuddering panic, with his muscles twitching as the pain came and went. Noah and Imogen worked quietly, each in their own world. For Noah, it was like a storm of memories, the winter his mother died, the promises he made to her on her deathbed, and the hard choice to stay in a world that got tighter and tighter every year. Imogen saw the faces of neighbors who had to leave their homes, ponies her father used to take across the moor, all replaced by corporate charity and shiny press releases. Finally, Imogen stood up straight and wiped the sweat from her forehead. She made herself a cup of tea and gave one to Noah. He took it, his hand shaking, and sat on the cold step of the forge. Imogen said, "You know, I looked up Ainsworth's lot codes from last year. That paint is blue and white? It matches a herd they sold after population control. It's all legal on paper. But the timing isn't right. They're moving horses out before the real freeze hits. It makes you wonder where they're going." Noah looked at the mare sleeping, and the pain in her body was like the pain in his chest. Maybe they aren't just making the herd smaller for the winter. They could be clearing space for something else. Imogen laughed hard, but it wasn't funny. "Call it what you want. Eco-lodges, safari tours, or something else. They sell the idea of wild Exmoor, but then they send the real thing to the continent." She stood there, pouring a bucket of water into the trough. "If Bramble got this far, she's a tough one. But she will need more than luck now." The roof was hit hard by snow. In the dark, the estates and their keepers made plans for their next move. They made deals over dinner, made plans by firelight, and had hands that were too clean to touch blood. Noah sat in front of the forge, feeling the weight of his choice settle over him. He could leave and say he did his best, or he could stand with Imogen, even if it meant getting into trouble. Imogen looked him in the eye. "I'll fix her up, but you better be ready if they come looking for her. They don't give up what they think is theirs." Noah nodded and got up to check the doors, making sure they were locked against the wind and anything else that might be out there. He stood still for a moment, listening to Bramble's heavy breathing, Imogen's soft humming, and the crackling of the forge fire. At that moment, the smithy didn't feel like a place to hide. It felt more like a line in the snow. The storm raged outside, but inside those walls, something new was starting. A stubborn refusal to leave this land and a belief that those who really cared for it could not be easily driven out. The morning was gray and cold, and the moorlands were covered in a thick fog that made trees disappear. Their branches looked like bones under a white sheet. The forge was still warm from the night before, and the air was thick with coal smoke and the ghost of old iron. Noah had slept in a broken chair with his knees pulled up to his chest and a blanket around his shoulders. He woke up suddenly to the sound of Bramble's heavy breathing and the mare's sides shaking in the dim light. Imogen was already awake. Her hands were slick with antiseptic, her hair was tied back, and her eyes were bright with stubborn determination but also worried. She knelt next to Bramble's head and whispered in a low voice, stroking the wild pony's shaking jaw with one hand. The smell of blood and wet hide mixed with the sharp smell of disinfectant and the coppery smell of the forge. Noah knelt next to Imogen, feeling the straw poke his knees and the ache of sleep still in his bones. Bramble's eyes were wide and glassy, and his nostrils were flared. He was breathing in short, panicked bursts. Under her messy coat, her muscles spasmed and rippled. Imogen said softly, without looking up, "She started early. Too soon." Noah took a deep breath. He remembered foalings from his mother's stories and from old work at the estate, which was always a risky thing to do. Without a vet, a proper stall, or even a good first aid kit, it felt like something wild and old out here. The shutters shook in the wind, which seemed to remind them how thin the walls really were. Imogen was in charge. She could make chaos seem manageable by giving orders in a calm but firm way. "Hey Noah, get the towels out of the basket. Heat them up by the forge. And the lamp, get it closer." Noah moved quickly, glad to have someone tell him what to do. The towels hissed with steam as he laid them over the iron. The lamp cast a yellow light over the small, tense circle of people, a mare, a midwife, and a witness. Bramble's sides were moving up and down, and her tail was weakly hitting the straw. Imogen put her ear to the mare's belly and listened for life. She looked up, and worry crossed her face. If the foal is in the wrong place. Noah's heart raced. He remembered helping with calvings and how quickly things could go wrong. But Imogen's hands were steady. She looked at Bramble, grumbled, then rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Bramble's pain was real, and her cries were muffled but heartbreaking. The world got smaller as the mare's pain grew stronger, Imogen's steady instructions, and the light flickered over the straw and stone. Moss the collie whined and walked back and forth at the edge of the forge. The minutes seemed to last for hours. Bramble was in pain. Her muscles were shaking, and she was sweating even though it was cold. Imogen's forehead was wrinkled and her lips were tight. She reached into the mare, her hands soft but firm. "She's stuck," Imogen said in a tight voice. "I need to turn him." Noah got closer and held Bramble's halter, mumbling nonsense. The mare shivered and showed its teeth, but it didn't attack. Imogen's face was set, and all she could think about was the fragile life that was hanging in the balance. The wind screamed outside and pushed snow against the metal roof. The world seemed far away. Only the forge, the fire, and this moment were real. Imogen turned, guided, and all of a sudden there was a rush of fluid, a slippery tumble of limbs and fur. For a heartbeat, everything was still. The foal lay still, half curled up in the straw, with its eyes closed and its ribs barely moving. Imogen wiped her hands, got a towel from the forge, and knelt down next to the baby. "Come on, little one." She rubbed the foal's nose hard and thumped its chest gently. Noah held his breath. The legs of the foal moved. Imogen kept rubbing, without stopping. Finally, a gasp and a weak, desperate whinny. The foal breathed in, sneezed, and then hit the towel with its legs. Bramble pushed herself up enough to touch her baby with her nose. The two of them were shaking and tangled up in the straw. Noah laughed shakily and rubbed his eyes. Imogen smiled, her cheeks red. "That's it. He's here, he's alive." They were amazed as the foal, Fen, struggled to stand up, which Imogen decided without ceremony. He fell down and tried again, with Bramble encouraging him with soft wickers. Imogen cleaned up the afterbirth, checked the foal's breathing, and then gave Noah another towel. "Make him move his legs. We need him to get up before it gets too cold." Noah worked slowly, getting Fen to stand up and massaging his shaking limbs. The foal's coat was light and had darker streaks on it. It was as soft as thistledown. For a moment, all the worries in the world seemed to go away. It was just a miracle birth on the edge of a frozen morning. But when Imogen checked Bramble, her fingers got caught on something in the mare's mane. She pulled, and her eyes narrowed. A length of steel cable was twisted through the thick hair, and the end was frayed and covered in blood. Imogen held it up for Noah to see, and her eyes flashed with anger. She said coldly, "That's not a rope. That's a dragline, a trap cable. Someone wanted to catch her fast. Not for rounding up, not by the book." Noah took the cable and felt how sharp and cruel it was on purpose. He said, "Not the way the estates are supposed to do it," his anger growing. He looked at Bramble, then at Imogen, and saw the same determination harden in her face. Imogen's voice was hard. "We need to tell someone. This isn't just culling. It's poaching, or worse, someone is making these horses disappear to make money, not to protect them." Noah nodded, feeling the weight of it settle on his shoulders. It was heavy but clear. He felt like he had a purpose for the first time in years, and it cut through his fear. He saw Fen, who was shaky but alive, nuzzling Bramble's side. A second chance that was hard to get. The sun rose behind the clouds, but there wasn't much light. Noah looked at the door, where the cold world was waiting. There would be questions and maybe trouble, but he didn't care anymore. Noah understood. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter how bad the odds were. And this weak, stubborn life was one of those things. The afternoon settled slowly and gray over the village, and the world outside the smithy was dull and gray. The storm had calmed down, but there was a dangerous stillness in the air. It felt like the wind was just waiting for you to turn your back so it could howl again. Noah saw the mare and her foal sleeping next to each other in the straw, where they were safe for now. Fen, who was tired from the fight to stay alive, twitched and snuggled up to Bramble, their breaths steaming in the cold air. The crisis had passed, but there was still a cold current of fear and questions running through it. Imogen didn't stay still for long. She looked at Noah with a look that said there was no room for argument after checking Bramble's wounds and wiping her hands on her apron. "There's only one man who knows every trick and corner in these hills," she said. "Edgar Whitlow is the only person who can tell us who set that cable." Noah took a moment to think. Edgar, the old gamekeeper, he hadn't seen him in a long time. People in the pub said that the man had gone half crazy because of the things he had done for the estates. But Imogen was correct. Edgar knew every hedge, every hidden glen, and every shortcut that had been made before the war. They put on warm clothes and left Moss in charge of the animals while they went out into the bitter cold. The snow had started to crust, making the slush turn to ice on the rutted paths. The village faded behind them, with chimneys sending up wisps of smoke and the sound of Imogen's forge fading into memory. Noah walked with his hands shoved deep into his pockets and his shoulders hunched against the wind. Imogen was in front, her boots crunching on the frost and her breath coming in quick, purposeful puffs. Not far from the western edge of Ainsworth Estate was Edgar's hut, which was at the edge of the forest. The place looked like it was hardly lived in. There were broken glass in the windows, mossy stone on the ground, and old game traps hanging from a nail above the door. The only thing that showed there was life was the thin line of smoke coming from the rusty chimney. Imogen knocked on the door. Nothing. She yelled Edgar's name into the silence again, this time louder. Finally, the door creaked open, and Edgar peeked out. He had wild hair and a thin frame, and his eyes were sharp but cautious. He looked at them in silence, taking in Imogen's fierce energy and Noah's battered look. Then he opened the door wider without saying anything. There wasn't much warmth inside, but it was real. In the corner, a small coal stove glowed, and a warm kettle whistled softly. The hut was messy but tidy, with everything in its right place and every inch used. There were old maps on the walls that had turned yellow over the years. They had handwritten notes, twine marking out forgotten paths, and names like Foxglove Combe, Hart's Hollow, and Shale Run. The last person to remember it kept the land's secret language alive. Edgar made them each a cup of tea, and his hand shook a little as he did it. He sat down across from them at the shaky table, his eyes never quite resting, as if he were still listening for something outside. Imogen put the frayed piece of cable on the table in front of them. At first, she didn't say anything. She just watched him and let the silence ask. For a long time, Edgar stared at the cable. He held his hands over it for a moment, then pulled them back, as if he were afraid to touch old sins. "That's not a state issue," he said finally, his voice a low rasp. "That's a snare line, quick, mean, and no time to care. Used to be okay, but not anymore. You found it in the marsh?" Noah nodded his head. "Got a mare who was pregnant. We would have died if we hadn't found her. The foal almost didn't make it. Ainsworth's code from last year's cull is blue and white, so she's marked." Edgar's eyes looked far away and haunted. "I've looked at that code. Last winter, they called it management. They moved a whole herd out and said it was for the land's health. The truth is that some went to buyers in France and some, who knows? We just moved them along and did what we were told." He pressed his lips together. "I drove the car myself, God help me." Imogen leaned in and spoke with intensity. "Edgar, someone isn't just moving horses, they're stealing them. Using traps that are not allowed. Do you know who is now working for Ainsworth?" Edgar nodded slowly. "Tom Kersey is in charge of the ground now. Hired men from the country don't care about rules. You should keep an eye on him." He suddenly stood up and walked over to the wall, where he pulled down a map that was so old that the folds were barely holding it together. He put it on the table and pointed to a deep, narrow valley shaded in blue ink. It was called Foxglove Combe. "If they're running horses off the books, they'll come through here. Old Cattle Lane, safe from the worst of the weather. There's a hole in the rock. A mudslide a few years ago blocked it for cars, but if you know how, you can still get ponies through." He drew a crooked line with his finger, his hand shaking and his voice lower. "I opened that way myself once, to kill someone. There isn't a new map that shows it." He drew a circle around a spot with a pencil and said, "But it's still there. This is your back door. This is what you use to get in or out without being seen. Noah looked at the map and realized what was going on. Foxglove Combe is the valley that everyone forgot about, even though it was right in front of them. Is the herd still there? He asked. Edgar's eyes were tired and full of years and regret. They were last week, what's left of them. You'll find them there if they're moving another lot soon. But be careful, Kersey's men don't follow the old rules. They'll do anything to keep their boss's secrets. Imogen carefully folded the map, her jaw set. Thanks, Edgar. For all of it. Edgar nodded, his eyes shining. I owe those horses more than I can ever pay back. Maybe this is a good start to helping you. Noah felt a sense of purpose grow in his chest as he and Imogen stepped outside into the gathering dusk, with the map in her hand. He felt the old fear, but also something stronger, hope, which was sharper now that he knew they had a way out of the dark. The cold bit at his face, and the moor stretched out in front of him, but the path was clear and the work was clear. If they acted quickly enough, there was still a chance to save what was left. The lights of Ainsworth Hall glowed gold against the cold blue dusk. Their warmth promised safety and elegance that seemed far away from the stormy moors. The long gravel driveway was full of cars, and the exhaust fumes filled the cold air as the county's richest people walked inside. Men in sharp tuxedos and women in silk gowns laughed as they walked inside. Noah stayed in the shadows, his cheap raincoat soaked and the cuffs covered in mud. The difference was so great that it almost made him smile. His boots even looked out of place here. But he couldn't leave now, not after what they had seen. Imogen walked next to him, her jaw set and her face pale but determined. She had borrowed a dark wool coat and polished boots. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid. She fit in better than Noah, but not by much. There was always a hint of fire and a thread of sharp edges in her presence. She took invitations out of her pocket that she had stolen from her uncle's kitchen table at his farm. Noah did what she said and kept his head down while she talked their way past the door stewards. The smell of roast beef, wine, and expensive perfume filled the air inside. The candlelight danced off the silver, crystal, and old oil paintings of ancestors who looked down with blank, unseeing eyes. There was a string quartet in the back, but the real music was the sound of glasses clinking and people talking. It was a world of comfort built on hundreds of years of quiet power, the kind of power that could wipe out 100 stories like brambles with just one word. Lord Sebastian Ainsworth stood on a dais at the far end of the room and gave orders. He was tall and handsome, with slick back salt and pepper hair and a perfectly fitted suit. He went from table to table, shaking hands and telling jokes that made the whole room laugh. He was charming in a way that was easy and smooth. He was the kind of man who could make you forget why you ever doubted him. Noah stood in the back, shifting his weight and looking for Tom Kersey among the faces. Imogen stood by the auction tables, squinting at the signs that read Spring Pasture Sponsor, Exmoor Rewilding Trust, and Heritage Pony Adoption. Funds go directly to conservation. The hypocrisy hurt. 3 guests, none of whom would ever set foot on the moor unless it was for a hunt or a photo shoot, gasped and oohed at a framed picture of wild ponies running through the early morning mist. A bell rang, and everyone turned to look at the front of the hall. Lord Sebastian stepped up to the microphone, and his voice filled the room. Friends, neighbors, and honored guests, thank you for being here for another year of partnership and promise. We are here tonight to protect Exmoor's treasures and make sure that future generations inherit not only the land but also the wild spirit that makes it special. He started talking about rewilding, duty, and legacy. He talked about balance, taking care of things, and bringing Exmoor back to its natural state. Every sentence was polished, rehearsed, and unclear. Noah saw how people nodded and felt the wave of goodwill rise. For a moment, he even wanted to believe it. But then, as the applause died down, Tom Kersey slipped in at the edge of the crowd. Kersey looked out of place in a suit because he had a thick neck, was heavy-set, and his eyes were always moving. He held his phone to his ear and frowned as he spoke into it, his voice low and urgent. Noah moved closer, weaving between servers carrying trays of canapes and trying to fit in. Kersey ducked behind a curtain near the kitchens on the far wall. Noah followed, making sure not to be seen. He pushed himself into a dark corner and tried hard to hear. Kersey's voice was tight. Yeah. Lot EX13, Dunridge Farm, the first thing to go. Get the truck ready and the paperwork ready. Don't want any trouble from the trust this time. He stopped for a moment, then hissed, tell them to get the paint off if they missed any. The last thing we need is for another one to show up in the wrong place. Noah's heart raced. EX13. He knew that code, just like Bramble's paint mark. So they were going to do another transfer in the morning. He listened as Kersey told him where to pick up Dunridge, one of the Ainsworth outlier properties, which is known for being very quiet. Noah backed away before Kersey was done and blended back in with the crowd. He saw Imogen at the auction table, her jaw tight as she watched a man who owned a chain of hotels win the sponsorship for spring grazing. Imogen's anger was like heat coming off of her. She whispered, "Did you get anything?" without looking at Noah. He nodded. They're moving more horses around at Dunridge, first. Kersey is making sure that everything is legal on paper. We have to be there before the sun comes up. They walked through the room together, picking up bits of conversation they heard, talk of grants for conservation, whispered deals, and hints that the trust was just a small part of a much bigger plan. Lord Sebastian caught Imogen's eye and smiled at her. His smile was all white teeth and no warmth. Imogen looked him in the eye without flinching. They left before dessert, their breath frosting in the night. The party was still going on behind them, with laughter coming through the windows and toasts being raised for the land and its history. Noah turned around once and saw Ainsworth, Kersey, and their guests lit by chandeliers. They looked like they were in a different world than the frozen mud and desperate ponies outside. But when they got to the beat-up truck at the end of the drive, Imogen put her hand on Noah's shoulder. They used rules and charity as a shield. But we now know the truth. Noah nodded, feeling the weight of the night, the lies, the smiles, and the danger that would be there in the morning. He looked out over the sleeping moors, felt the cold wind lift his hair, and knew he couldn't go back. They would meet the dark side of rewilding tomorrow before dawn. And this time, they would be ready. As Noah and Imogen walked toward Dunridge Farm, the night was long and cold over the moor. The moon was just a pale smear behind a cloud. The headlights of the Land Rover swept over the narrow road, revealing frost-covered hedges, barbed wire, and the gnarled remains of old hawthorn trees. They didn't talk much. Every word seemed to crackle in the quiet, full of fear and excitement. Imogen looked at her phone by the light of the dash. She said, "Still nothing from Edgar. But we can't wait. We need to see what they're hiding before anyone else gets there if they move at dawn." Noah's jaw was tight and he held onto the wheel even tighter. He couldn't stop thinking about how much pain Bramble was in or how hard Fenn's little body had fought for breath. Every bump in the road seemed to bring them closer to a line they couldn't cross. They parked a quarter-mile away, behind a group of twisted pines. The farm was too quiet. No barking from the barn dogs or movement from the house. A thin band of pale light shone through a window in the far-off buildings. The rest was dark. Noah zipped up his coat, threw a worn canvas bag over his shoulder, and followed Imogen through a hole in the hedge. They moved quickly and low, their boots crunching on the frost and their breath fogging up behind their scarves. The only sounds that broke the silence were the distant bark of a fox and the hollow moan of the wind. Noah felt naked, with every shadow in the field stretching out long and sharp. They got to the end of the property. Imogen pointed out a row of temporary metal pens with a set of new tire tracks leading up to them. The pens were thrown up quickly and messily, just enough to hold a nervous herd until the trucks got there. The smell of hay, fear, and old manure was very faint. Ponies huddled together in the biggest pen, their eyes wide with fear and their breath rising in silver plumes. Noah counted at least 12 of them. They were dun and bay, and their coats were covered in mud and had paint marks on them. One mare stomped on the frozen ground, her ears twitching at every sound she heard. Imogen squatted down and took pictures with her phone. "Look at the marks," she said quietly. "Same coat as Bramble. That's not a coincidence. And the trust paperwork says that they are all surplus." Noah's eyes fell on a folding table next to the pen. He crept closer, his heart racing, and saw a row of tranquilizer guns next to syringes, zip ties, and big piles of paperwork. There was a clipboard with shipping manifests on it. The destination was Portsmouth Port, and the consignee was an export company he didn't know. The paperwork had the Ainsworth Trust seal and Tom Kersey's name on it. He shook his hands as he flipped through the papers. There were lists of animals by code and color on each page, along with vague notes about population control and eco-conservation transfer. There was no mention of where the horses would go, just that they were leaving Exmoor for sustainable environments abroad. Noah thought this was a legal trick to hide cruelty behind the guise of charity. Imogen looked out at the horizon and then pushed Noah's arm. "We can't get them all out tonight. We might be able to stop the next round, though, if we can get real proof." Noah nodded sadly. He put the clipboard in his bag and then started filming everything: the pens, the paint marks, the tranquilizers, and even the license plate of the truck parked in the shadows. Imogen tiptoed up to the barn door, looked inside, and gasped softly. Inside, there were a few smaller pens with hurt horses in them. Their heads were hanging low. One had a cut on her leg, and the other had a swollen eye. Imogen knelt by the closest one and stroked her neck, her eyes burning with quiet rage. "They're not just killing. They're breaking them. Sending out the ones that live and hiding the others." Noah got very angry. He thought about the empty promises and the laughter and bright lights of the gala. He wanted to break something and yell at the quiet world for letting this happen. He took a deep breath and thought about what he needed to do instead. A door on the other side of the barn suddenly banged open. Footsteps, heavy and purposeful, crunched on the gravel. Noah and Imogen ducked behind a hay bale, their hearts racing. Tom Kersey's voice rang out in the cold air, sharp and impatient. "Load up the first lot. I want to leave before the sun rises. Trust orders say this is all above board." Another man grunted in response. The sound of hooves on metal, scared whinnies, and the clang of a trailer ramp filled the air. Noah pressed himself against the wall and watched as men drove the ponies into the waiting truck. Each animal hesitated, and some tried to run away, but they were pushed and prodded, and panic grew in the small space. Imogen's hands were clenched at her sides. Noah took advantage of the time when Kersey left to answer the phone. He ran forward and opened the barn door just wide enough for Imogen to get in. They moved quickly, letting some of the herd ponies go in the hopes that the men would be confused and slow down. A sudden scream, one of the guards saw them. "Hey! Who's there?" he yelled. Noah took Imogen's arm and they ran to the field, ducking under the corral rails and sliding their boots in the mud. There were shouts behind them and flashlight beams swinging all over the place. They ran through the hole in the hedge, their lungs burning and the cold biting at their skin. They didn't stop until they got to the Land Rover, where they were out of breath and shaking. Imogen jumped into the passenger seat. "Go." "Oh," she said. Noah turned on the engine, and the wheels started to spin as he drove away. The distant shouts were drowned out by the wind. Imogen pressed her phone to her chest as they sped down the frozen lane. She felt both relieved and scared. "We have proof," she said in a low voice. "But now they'll come for us." Noah's hand shook as he drove. "Let them come," he said. "We're not alone. And this time, we know where to go to fight." The headlights cut a path through the dark, and the moor stretched out in front of them, wild and endless. No matter what, the truth would have to come out tomorrow. Noah and Imogen had already crossed half the valley by the time the first light of dawn broke over Exmoor. Their boots were covered in frost and mud. The air was cold and hurt their throats, and every time they exhaled, it rose like smoke as they hurried toward Foxglove Coombe. Noah's bag was heavy with the stolen clipboard and video evidence, but what was even heavier was the thought of what could happen here if they were too late. The ground sloped down into a hidden hollow where the grass grew thick even in winter and the morning mist hugged the ground. Noah had only heard stories about Foxglove Coombe. People whispered about it in pubs, and it was hard to find on most maps. It was a place that was safe from the wind and prying eyes. It was where the last, most wild herds of Exmoor ponies lived. Edgar Whitlow met them by the ruins of a gate. The cold made the lines on his face look deeper. His coat was old and worn, and his pockets were full of hand-drawn maps and tools. For a moment, he looked just like the ghost of the old estate, as familiar as stone in the landscape. Edgar grunted. "I thought you wouldn't come," as they got closer. "There's a lot of Kersey's men around the main lane. But they'll never take this route. Old cattle cut through the rocks, which are easy to miss unless you know what to look for." He stepped aside and led them through a gap in a low stone wall and down a narrow trail, where the mud sucked at their boots. Foxglove Coombe opened up in front of them like a secret that had been kept all winter. The pale sun shone on the hardy grass and the ponies' silver backs as they huddled together for warmth. The herd walked slowly, with their heads down and their sides pressed together. Bramble was there, limping but standing up straight. Fen was shaky but determined as he tried to nuzzle milk from his mother's side. Noah's heart swelled with relief when he saw it. "They made it," he said, and Imogen's eyes sparkled with hope. They crouched in the brush, out of sight for a moment, and just watched. "The pain and tiredness of the past few days faded away when I saw something so old and wild, life pushing through and not giving up." Edgar looked out at the horizon to see if anything was moving. "They'll try to get them out through the main gate and push them toward the trucks. But if we hurry, we can take the old path through the rocks, which goes straight to the open moor. I opened it years ago for the drives. Then I shut it again when I realized what they were really doing." His voice shook, and every word showed how sorry he was. Noah held on to Edgar's shoulder, thankful but not saying anything. "You're doing the right thing for them now." Edgar nodded, his jaw tight, and then he pointed with his walking stick. "Slowly and steadily, you two start leading them toward the gully. I'll get the cigarettes ready." It's an old poacher's trick to cover up their scent and scare the horses just enough to get them to move, but not run away. Imogen was the first to move. She spoke softly and steadily to Bramble as she gently led her toward the path Edgar had marked on the map. Noah helped the others by spreading his arms wide and making himself a human fence. At first, the ponies were scared and didn't want to go because they weren't used to such gentle hands after days of fear. But slowly, hunger and trust won out. Fen fell and stumbled, but Bramble pushed him along and never let him fall behind. They worked fast, and even though they were working hard, their sweat froze on their skin. Their nerves were as tight as harpstrings. Noah thought he would hear a shout or see headlights breaking the morning gloom every second. There was only the sound of hooves moving through the grass and the soft snort of horses. As soon as they got to the gully, Edgar lit a few smoke bombs and threw them near the main path. White and blue clouds floated through the air, making it hard for anyone to see what was going on and hiding the scent trail from both dogs and people. Imogen smiled fiercely. "Old tricks work best, huh?" Noah led the ponies through the narrow crack in the rocks, his heart racing with every step. Bramble walked ahead with her head held high, and Fen stayed close to her side. The rest of the herd followed. There were no fences or trucks on the other side of the gully. Just rolling grass and the sound of a hawk in the distance. Noah stood there for a long time, looking after them. He felt both happy and sad at the same time. He whispered, "We did it." Imogen gave him a quick, tight hug. "We're not done yet. There is still the trust, Kersey, and Ainsworth, and everything else they are trying to hide." Edgar came after, limping and with bright eyes. "I never thought I'd be the one to save them." He smiled, which was a rare, crooked thing. "I always thought it would be someone younger and braver. Happy it was you two." Noah looked at the damaged bag and the hard evidence inside, the papers, the pictures, and the video. "We have to get this out. Make sure that no one can deny what's going on here. They'll do this to people who get in their way, too, if they can do it to ponies." The three of them walked back up the trail, with the sounds of the freed herd behind them. Imogen took out her phone and sent the first pictures to a private group of reporters and activists. "Now they're going to see it." "Yes, everyone is." Noah stopped at the top of the valley and looked back one last time as the sun came out. The ponies ran out into the moor, wild and defiant against the morning. For the first time in years, Noah felt like he belonged right here, in this fight, with these people, on this stubborn, living land. The engines of trucks and the shouts of men began to rise behind them, on the other side of the coombe. The fight wasn't over yet, but hope burned like fire in his blood. He squared his shoulders and walked behind Imogen and Edgar to see what would happen next. By noon, Foxglove Coombe was buzzing with nervous energy. Noah and Imogen took turns looking out at the horizon, listening for the sound of tires crunching or a dog barking far away. The last group of ponies grazed uneasily on the other side of the valley, their hooves churning up muddy spots where the thin grass had survived the winter. Bramble and fen stayed close to each other, always within Imogen's sight. Edgar kept himself busy on the ridge above, moving like a shadow through the bracken, his pockets full of smoke bombs and old tricks. He kept looking over at the hidden gully, as if he half expected ghosts from his past to come out of the trees. The peace was broken just before noon. The quiet was broken by the distant roar of engines. First came one, then two, then three black Land Rovers, followed by two cattle trucks and a shiny SUV. The line of people moved slowly along the main track until it reached the old cattle gate. Lord Sebastian Ainsworth himself came out, his coat flapping in the wind and a smile on his face that looked like armor. Tom Kersey followed closely behind, with a group of men in branded vests on either side of him. Each man had a radio and a serious look on his face, ready to work. Noah's heart raced as he looked at the faces. This wasn't a normal roundup. There were reporters, a drone flying above, and signs near the entrance saying, "Ainsworth Rewilding Trust, Population Management in Action." Everything was set up for the cameras. Imogen wiped her hands on her jeans, squared her shoulders, and walked down the hill with Noah next to her. She spoke softly and kept her eyes on the trucks. "They want a show. At least where the press can see, they'll do everything by the book." Lord Sebastian waved to the reporters, and his voice rose in a smooth, confident way. "Thanks for coming today. As part of our ongoing care for Exmoor, we are moving some of our herds to new areas in a controlled way to keep them healthy and the landscape in balance. Conservation must always come first." The cameras clicked. A few people from the area watched from behind a taped-off area, not sure if they should cheer or be quiet. Tom Kersey yelled orders at his men, telling them to get the portable corrals ready. Noah saw that the other truck was being loaded with tranquilizer guns, ropes, and new paperwork, everything that was needed to make the operation look real. Imogen stepped forward and stood in front of the main corral gate. Noah could see the fire in her eyes, even though she was calm. "What about the animals that are hurt?" she yelled, and her voice cut through the PR chatter. "What about the ones that were marked for culling but were left for dead?" Sebastian smiled, showing off his patience and polish. "We care about the well-being of animals, Ms. Hale. Every incident is fully recorded and dealt with in the best way possible. The trust is always open and honest." Imogen crossed her arms and wouldn't move. "Then why have I found horses with wire wounds and code marks that match the cull from last year? Why is a local farrier the only one fixing them up instead of your own staff?" The head of a reporter snapped up. The PR guy moved around nervously. For a brief moment, Sebastian's smile faltered, but he quickly got it back. He said, "Of course we'll look into any concern," and waved Kersey forward. "But today, let's look at the bright side. Exmoor is a good example of responsible rewilding. This is a step forward." Kersey's jaw tightened as he tried to push Imogen out of the way, but Noah stepped forward with his phone held high. With just one tap, he started a live broadcast that sent video directly to a growing number of local groups and activists. Noah said, "We're writing down everything today," and he made sure everyone could hear him. Not any more secrets. Edgar's smoke bombs fell from the ridge, making blue and white clouds swirl through the corral. The horses whinnied and huddled together. They were scared but not panicked. Some reporters coughed and moved back, not sure if this was part of the event or not. Kersey yelled, "Get that mess out of here! Get out of the way!" But Imogen stood her ground and looked Sebastian in the eye. "You said that rewilding was for the community. Why are fences still keeping people out?" Why can't the people who live there access land they've lived on for generations? Now there were more questions. Some reporters pointed their microphones at Sebastian, and some even pointed them at Imogen. The carefully planned event started to fall apart. One of Kersey's men complained, "If they would just shut up and let us work, we could be done by now." Sebastian then let something slip when he was under pressure. He looked at the drone and then at the cattle trucks. The Eco-Lodge project will help cover some of the costs. Now that the extra herds are gone, there's room to rewild the area for high-end ecotourism. It's a new future for Exmoor, one that will be good for both nature and the people who live there. The words came out quickly, half true, and were just enough for the sharpest ears to hear. Imogen's voice was clear. "You mean the land will be fenced off, the locals will be pushed out, and the real wild herds will be sent overseas? Rewilding is just a way to make money." There were whispers in the crowd. The cameras turned away from Sebastian, showing the doubt on his face. This time, Edgar set off another smoke bomb closer to the trucks, and the herd started to move and mill around. Kersey cursed under his breath to try to get things back under control, but the old tricks were working, people were getting confused, and the horses were moving closer to the secret exit Edgar had marked. Noah kept the camera rolling, recording every word and every mistake. Imogen never gave up. "We're not going anywhere, and neither are the ponies. Let the public see the books, the vet records, and the transport logs if you're so sure of your stewardship. Let's find out what transparency means." Sebastian, finally shaken, forced a weak smile. "We'll set up a meeting. Please move to the side for now." Imogen shook her head. "No. This isn't the end. Until every voice here is heard and every wild pony has a chance to live free." Noah knew the real battle was just beginning as the last of the smoke drifted across Foxglove Coombe and the herd started to move toward the hidden gully. Now the whole world was watching, and there was no going back. Things went crazy in Foxglove Coombe. The scene that Lord Sebastian and Kersey had planned for the press now spun out of their control, turning into yelling, confusion, and a growing storm of resistance. The smoke bombs that Edgar had thrown rolled low over the grass, wrapping around hooves and boots and making the sunlight look thin and blue. Some horses snorted and stomped, while others pawed at the ground or crowded around the gully where the wild grass grew thick. Kersey yelled orders, his face red and frantic, and waved his radio over his head as his men rushed to close ranks around the herd. The cameras, which were supposed to show responsible management, were now swinging all over the place, trying to keep up. The reporters, who were half choked by smoke, moved closer to the fences. Some of them even filmed the chaos on their own phones. Noah felt the energy change like a thunderclap. He got Imogen's attention. This was it. No more waiting, no more asking men who thought of the moor as their inheritance and the ponies as property for permission. He saw the fear in the horse's eyes and felt something break open in his chest, a white-hot, blinding certainty that this fight was right. He ran along the fence line, kicking at the old posts and unhooking latches until one broke. Imogen was already at the next panel, slipping through and waving her arms wide to show the leaders of the herd the hidden gully Edgar had marked. "Come this way. This way, girls, come on, take it easy now." Her voice, low and strong, cut through the fear. A young stallion broke first, his muscles rippling as he raced toward the gap, with Bramble and Fen on either side of him. The herd surged, their hooves thundering and their manes flying. Time slowed for a moment. Noah saw Fen almost trip, and Bramble pushed him up. They both moved forward with the tide of wild bodies. "Stop them!" Kersey yelled. "Get those gates!" But Edgar, who was standing high on the ridge with a flare in each hand, sent up a burst of colored smoke that blinded the men and made their dogs howl. The herders hesitated, coughing and swearing, as their plans fell apart. As Kersey lunged for Imogen, his face twisted with rage. She ducked under a rail. She turned to the side, and the old farrier's strength made her shoulders weak. He fell into the mud. "You'll pay for this, Hale," he yelled. He spat and jumped up. Imogen just smiled. "Like steel. First you, Kersey." Noah, out of breath and with bruises, made it to the top of the gully where Edgar was leading the wild ones with his old shepherd's crook. "Come this way, through here," Edgar called, his voice shaking but proud. The ponies came into the gully one by one, and the herd's speed was now unstoppable. The narrow path led to an open moor. When the ponies broke free, the sun shone on their wild and beautiful coats. For a moment, the moor was alive with the sound of 100 hooves beating, echoing over the hills. In the coombe, the hired men got back together. Some ran after the horses, while others tried to take control of the cameras and reporters. Lord Sebastian, who had lost his polite mask, yelled at his PR man and told him to stop the feeds and silence the witnesses. But Noah's and Imogen's phones were still streaming, and the truth was spreading across the internet for everyone to see. There were already dozens of people joining the fight in real time, and the chat feeds were already full of anger and support. Then, in the chaos, Noah saw something shiny on the front seat of the main truck, a small, damaged metal case that was half hidden under some papers. He ran across the yard, heart racing, and grabbed it just as a guard yelled. He threw himself behind the next corral, breaking the case open. Inside was a portable hard drive with the Ainsworth Trust logo on it. A note that said Shipping Manifest, Archive, all years was taped to the side. Names, dates, and transactions. An unknown box for the whole thing. Noah's hand shook as he put it in his bag and ducked down as two men came up behind him. He ran back toward the gully, slipping in the mud and on the grass that had been trampled. Imogen was there, waving him on as the last of the herd went into the open land beyond. Edgar lit another flare for cover, and the last dogs ran away. Kersey rallied his crew for one last try, cracking his whip at the edge of the coombe. The sound was like gunfire in the open air. But the herd was gone, too far away, and the gap was too big to close. As things calmed down, police cars, called by the noise, the video, or maybe even a guilty conscience, came up the main road. At first, local police officers were confused, but then they jumped into the fight as reporters crowded around, shoving microphones into Kersey, Sebastian, Imogen, and even Noah's faces. Edgar stepped forward with his shoulders straight and eyes full of history. He said softly, "It's over. You have your proof. Let's see them talk their way out of this now." Noah gave the officer the hard drive. Imogen gave the phone, which already had video and testimony on it. Everything is in there, every lie, every injury, and every deal. Kersey tried to act tough, and Sebastian tried to be charming, but the tide had turned. Reporters crowded in, and the police blocked off the area. In the distance, the wild ponies grazed on fresh, safe grass for the first time in too long. Noah leaned against the broken fence, out of breath and with his heart racing from exhaustion and relief. Imogen found him and hugged him around the shoulders. Edgar came over and smiled quietly, his face showing signs of age. They all watched the last of the dust settle over Foxglove Combe, and hope and justice filled the air. It felt like the moor belonged to itself again for the first time. As news of the day's chaos spread far beyond the valley, evening swept across the moor, turning Foxglove Combe gold and dark. The air was charged, but not with fear anymore. It was full of strong, raw hope. When Noah and Imogen got back to the village, every pub and kitchen in the area was full of stories. Thousands of people had already seen the footage from Noah's live stream. Local newsrooms and social media were flooded with photos, videos, and witness statements. People who had never thought much about wild ponies or land rights were glued to their screens, angry and shocked by the truth behind Ainsworth's rewilding project. The village hall was full that night, with people standing in line to get in. There was no space left on any of the benches, windowsills, or walls. There were a lot of voices in the air: farmers, shopkeepers, kids on their parents' laps, and people from the town who hadn't been out in years. Someone brought in a broken old TV and a projector that showed pictures on the whitewashed back wall of the hall. The ponies broke free, Kersey cracked his whip, and Sebastian Ainsworth's face was caught between anger and disbelief. The local council had called an emergency meeting, but it was clear that tonight was for the people. Imogen stood at the front of the room next to a long table full of evidence, including shipping manifests, vet records, the rescued hard drive, and her own phone playing the key video clips over and over again. Noah, still in his mud-stained boots, and Edgar, with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes somewhere between memory and hope, sat next to her. Lord Sebastian came in a sharp suit with his PR manager by his side. He was barely able to keep his composure. But his famous smile was gone, and he sounded unsure as he tried to calm the crowd. "We never meant to. There must be a misunderstanding or some mistakes in the process." The projector showed the moment he bragged about the eco-lodge, when the word surplus came out of his mouth and the cameras caught every cold calculation. There was no way to hide now. There was an older woman in the front row who stood up. Her voice shook, but it was clear. "You said that this land belonged to everyone. You told a lie. These ponies have always lived here." The hall was filled with a wave of applause. Sebastian hesitated as he reached for his notes, but the questions came quickly and sharply, from reporters, local farmers, and even the kids who wanted to know why the wild horses had to suffer so that someone else could get rich. Imogen spoke calmly and laid out the timeline: the marks on Bramble, the cable trap, the trust paperwork, the quiet suffering at Dunridge Farm, and finally the evidence that was gathered and shared that day. She finished by asking the council to protect Foxglove Combe as a place for everyone to enjoy, not just the rich. Noah didn't say much, but when he stood up, everyone in the room got quiet. He looked at his hurt hands and then at the people who were looking at him. "I was raised here. I've seen the land change. We lost too much too many times. I say we should keep what we have. Let's take care of it together." The councilors, who were more politicians than heroes, looked at each other, then at the evidence in front of them, the crowded room, and the cameras that were streaming the meeting live, making it a national event. When the time came, everyone agreed quickly: an immediate investigation into Ainsworth Trust, a halt to all eco-lodge development, and a freeze on all funds until an independent audit could be done. After the trouble at the combe, the police were already there and started taking statements and collecting evidence. Officers led Tom Kersey out of the hall, ignoring his protests as the crowd moved aside. Sebastian Ainsworth sat still while his PR man whispered frantic plans in his ear, but the hall didn't pay attention to them. The magic was gone. People poured out into the cool night after the meeting, their voices full of relief, anger, pride, and hope. There was already a bonfire crackling at the other end of the green. Kids ran in circles, singing about freedom and wild ponies. Farmers who had been wary of each other before now shook hands and slapped each other on the back. Even the doubters, who thought nothing could ever change, smiled when they thought about what they had done together. Edgar stayed at the edge of the crowd, not quite alone but not too close. Imogen found him, squeezed his hand, and her voice was thick. "You saved them. You were to blame for all those years. You gave them back to us now." Edgar shook his head, and tears shone in the firelight. "I just did what I could to make things right. Now it's your turn." Noah joined them, and the three of them stood together at the edge of the moor. The last glow of the bonfire flickered above them, and the cries of the freed herd echoed across the hills. The investigation grew in the days that followed. "Ponies freed, truth exposed, and rewilding or ruse" were some of the headlines in the news. The trust accounts were frozen, and Ainsworth's Eco-Lodge project was put on hold. Kersey was accused of being cruel, committing fraud, and making false documents. But what happened in the weeks that followed was more important than any headline. Foxglove Combe was officially recognized as protected common land, open to everyone and cared for by the community. Edgar led a group of volunteers to fix up the old paths, making sure that the only barriers were the ones that were needed to keep the ponies safe and not keep people out. People now spoke her name with respect as she went back to her forge. Noah looked at the land for the first time and felt like he belonged there, not just like he was going to survive. He and Imogen walked the ridge together on a foggy morning, watching Bramble and Fen eat with the herd. The wind brought the smell of grass and rain, the sound of the church bell ringing in the distance, and the sound of kids laughing on the hill. Noah smiled. The feeling of home eased the pain in his heart. Imogen held his hand tightly. "We'll keep an eye on things from now on." Noah nodded, looking at the ponies below. The land around them was finally theirs. Nobody gets left behind from now on. The moor kept rolling on, old, stubborn, and free. And for the first time in a long time, its people did too.